Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sake Revolution. This is America's first sake podcast, and I'm your host, John Puma from the Sake Notes. Also, the administrator over at the Internet Sake Discord, the guy on the show who is not a sake samurai, and just a sake nerd like you guys.
And I'm your host, Timothy Sullivan. I'm a sake samurai, I'm a sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And every week, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake, and doing our best to make it fun and easy to understand.
That is right, Tim. Now, Tim, I understand that once again, although a little more literally, we have a guest in the studio.
Literally in the
Can you
studio,
confirm this?
yes. Sitting next to me.
Because it's not my studio.
Sitting next to me is our VIP guest.
Oh. Yeah. Now, this is for our listeners at home. This is actually part 2 of a two-parter. That's been a long time coming. Is that right, Tim?
Yes. This is part 2 of our award-winning series, Married to Sake.
That's right. If our sake historians want to go back to episode 22, they will find part 1 where we interviewed my wife, Myshell, and she told us all about the really interesting, we'll call them, sakes that she likes finding when she goes to various places in Japan, and how my sake tastes do not line up with that at all. Today, we have Tim's other half. We have Scott.
Yes.
Scott, say hello. Say hello to the Sake Revolution universe.
Hi, Sake Revolution universe.
So when we had Myshell on the show, we were exploring what it's like to be married to a sake nerd and have kind of one foot in that world and one foot in reality. And so now we're going to explore Scott's point of view.
So, absolutely. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun to kind of get into the weeds. And we're going to learn a lot about Tim, I think, on today's episode, whether he likes it or not.
Ruh-roh.
So Scott, tell me, how long have you guys been together? How long have you been married?
I better get this right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We've been married.
Tim's right there to fact check you, though.
We've been married almost 2 years.
Oh, wow. And how long were you together before that?
2005. So we met in May of 2005. So it's been a long time.
Right. I imagine that back then, Tim was not yet let me make sure I get all this right, the sake samurai, sake educator, and the founder of the Urban Sake website, was he?
No, he actually wasn't.
And so who introduced who to sake here? Was this something that you had in your back pocket and you sprung on Tim? Or was it something he was already kind of playing with and he's like, hey, wait a minute, let me tell you about this plan I have about becoming a sake samurai, sake educator, and the founder of the Urban Sake website?
No, actually, well, I don't really drink, so that's kind of the ironic part of this.
That is.
And I think the way when we first started to meet, I would try to pick out really interesting New York places that I loved. And we went to a little hole-in-the-wall sushi place it's a little north of Houston Street. And they have just really fresh sushi, right? So we went on a date there. I think it was an early date, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they had, I think that was the first time you wanted to try premium sake. And they had like a menu on the wall with really cool drawings and great looking kanji, and you just picked one.
Yeah, I was just inspired. We were having dinner and I just thought, why don't I give this a try? I really didn't know anything about sake or Japanese culture.
The Tim side of this story you guys can find in episode 18, where he tells us about his first experience with Hakai-san. Apparently, we're learning now, on a date with Scott. Actually, we learned it in that episode too, but we're trying to make it sound dramatic. So, Scott, did you also try the Hakai-san that fateful day?
I did, but I don't think it struck me quite like it struck Tim.
Yes.
Well, maybe a little less, because he changed careers after we had it. But you did enjoy it.
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, I think one of the things I've learned is that it just pairs so well with food. And especially with sushi. And it's almost like they don't alter the food to match the sake. And I think wines, it's oftentimes they oversalt food in order to match the wine. So maybe this is not true, but that's something we discovered later when we went out for a Thanksgiving dinner at a real nice restaurant, and the wine just didn't work so well with the food.
Now, I do want to clarify one thing. Scott said he wasn't a drinker, but Scott will taste everything.
I'll taste everything.
It's not like he doesn't drink. I don't want people thinking that he doesn't drink at all.
Right,
but
right. And I think probably a little like Myshell, I tend to like funkier kinds of things, or a little different.
How did you discover that your tastes were in that realm? Or was this just a matter of being around Tim and tasting things all the time and being like, oh, wait, this one?
I think it's more that. We would just, when Tim was first getting into it, we would kind of, it's a little daunting when you see a large menu and you don't know what you're doing. And we would try a lot of different things, right, in the beginning.
Yeah. And honestly, thinking back on it, it was a great way to start dating someone. Like we had this thing to share, like going out to eat to Japanese restaurants, exploring the city, finding cool places to eat.
Yeah. And interesting,
nice.
Even that we went to, Tim, we would go to a lot of pairings. I think there were many more in the very beginning when we were first dating. And there was actually some really unique ones. We went to a dessert pairing. And I distinctly, it was really interesting.
Sake and dessert.
Yeah, a Japanese dessert place in Hell's Kitchen. And one of the things that struck me was there was a sake on the list. I don't even remember what it was called, but it kind of tasted like burnt rubber tires. And it paired really, really well with pecan pie.
I gotta know what the sake was. My life will be incomplete until I find the burnt rubber tire sake that pairs really well with pecan pie.
I mean, with a grain of salt, right? That was my description of the tasting notes. I'm sure no one would say, oh, this has hints of burnt rubber tire.
You'd be surprised. Before sake came along, what did you like to taste? Like any cocktails or anything like that?
No,
or,
I actually...
beers and wines, stuff like that?
I don't really drink cocktails. I mean, I like to pretend I like bourbon, but it's kind of a joke between Tim and me. Or I pretend that I like Manhattan.
That's a great conversation starter, apparently. My interest was piqued, and I was like, wow, he likes bourbon. Whoa. Doesn't really like to drink, but he's into bourbon. That's so surprising.
Or that I might like a Manhattan, right? But I've never really had a Manhattan either.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say, like, if we go out to dinner to a non-Japanese restaurant and I order a glass of wine, Scott's going to take a couple sips of it and we're going to talk about what it tastes like. Or if Scott orders his own glass of wine, chances are very, very high that I'm going to finish it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So usually I try to pick something that Tim might like too.
Okay.
That's sweet.
That makes sense.
That's sweet.
In the recent past, for his job, Tim would need to frequently visit Japan. And before that, when it was him getting and indulging this hobby more, did you get to go with him often, or have you been to Japan with Tim on his excursions?
The first time we went to Japan, actually it's kind of funny and a little ironic because I'm third generation Japanese American, right? Mm-hmm. And I had never been to Japan. Our family never went on vacations there or anything, even though my dad really wanted to. And the very first time I went was a cruise that Tim got asked to be the sake educator on. It was kind of mind-blowingly amazing. And
I never heard about this.
It was crazy.
Yes. It was it was something that just kind of fell into my lap. It was a cruise from Alaska to Japan. It was a 2-week cruise over the Pacific Ocean and around Japan. And it was amazing. And I got invited to be the sake educator on this cruise. And Scott came along and we had this wonderful time on the ship. And I taught 5 or 6 classes while we were crossing the Pacific. And then when we got to Japan, we would stop in, Hokkaido. Then we went to Sendai. Then we went to Tokyo. So we stopped in all the ports all around the islands of Japan. And we had like day trips here and there. And that was so much fun.
Oh my gosh. It was.
What a good memory. That was in 2009.
Yeah.
That sounds incredible. That sounds really like a very unique opportunity, a very unique situation.
Oh, and it wasn't just a regular cruise. It was an all-inclusive, really luxury line cruise. We had both never really been on cruises before.
Yeah. It was a luxury cruise ship, and we could have never in a million years afforded it on our own, but we just had this really amazing experience. And that was our first trip to Japan together.
Right. It was so great.
But we've gone several other times since then together.
Right. We had such a great time. But it was probably better that we were able to see Japan, for me, for the first time. It was so eye-opening.
Nice. And by then, Tim, how many trips was that for you?
My first trip was in 2007. I probably went twice in 2008. So it was roughly my fourth trip to Japan.
Oh, that's pretty early then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I actually thought Tim wouldn't take to Japan because the very first trip, it was when he was awarded the Sake Samurai Award.
Really? That was your first
That
trip,
was his first
Tim?
trip to Japan.
So you guys had told you we're going to be learning a lot about Tim.
And he, I think he liked it, but it was so foreign. He said it was just one of the most foreign experiences he'd ever been on. People would not look at you in the eye. Doing basic things like getting a subway ticket was just so complicated and hard to figure out. And it wasn't really a warm and welcoming experience. So I was like, oh, maybe it's not going to turn into much. But it actually...
How wrong you were.
Yeah, I was so wrong. He just got more deeply into Japan and understanding a lot about the culture and how to behave in Japan and for a Westerner, and taught me a lot about that as well.
The experience of going to Japan has changed a lot since then.
Yeah.
I mean, because I went in 2006 for the first time, so this is probably close around then. And doing it then, as opposed to doing it now, it's so much more streamlined. There's honestly a lot more English to be had. It's much easier to get subway tickets, that's for sure, and charge up your Suica cards and all of that. But I imagine that back then for you, especially being solo on something like that, must have been a little harrowing.
Yeah, but I think my takeaway from that is that the good experiences, the hospitality I did receive, the food I did eat, the sake experiences I had, all that outweighed the challenges.
Yeah.
And that got me intrigued.
I mean, I think that's sometimes a kind of a telling hurdle. Is like, well, how does somebody react when they have the challenge like that, when they have the hurdle? If they have it and they see it as a thing to be overcome and double down, that's great. And it does say a lot about where things went for you career-wise in the following years. So it sounds like it was a great time. Do you have any other memorable visits to Japan with Tim? Any gossip? Any stories you want to tell us? Embarrassing tales of?
Yeah. So since obviously I look very Japanese. I'm Japanese American. So it's not necessarily the place, but what would happen, it was just kind of a funny dynamic where I'm actually really into reflexology, right? So there were all these really great reflexology places in Japan. And I think one of my first experiences there was in the Ginza. We found a reflexology place. Tim had to go in and explain what I wanted because I don't speak any Japanese. I don't understand any Japanese. But they would keep looking at me like expecting me to be able to speak Japanese, and I couldn't. So when Tim would, it was just so surprising for them, and they couldn't get in the habit of looking straight at Tim to ask what I wanted.
So I was going to ask if you spoke any Japanese, but apparently that's been answered. Now, Tim, you've been learning Japanese over the years. Have there's been any cross-pollination? Have you learned Japanese from Tim?
Yeah. I think there are like words here and there that I know because of Tim, which is also funny.
Yeah, mostly restaurant stuff, right? Like how to get the bill and all that kind of stuff.
Right,
yeah.
right.
That's important stuff when you're visiting or vacationing and stuff like that.
And the other really memorable thing, this is more kind of, I think, really interesting. We had planned another vacation in Japan, and Tim was going to meet me in Tokyo. I was supposed to fly into Tokyo, and I had a friend help me get the ticket. It was really, really nice because this person works for the airlines. And it happened that an hour before I was supposed to land, the big, giant earthquake hit in Sendai.
Oh.
The March 2011.
March, 2011.
Yeah. So that's the big Tohoku earthquake happened, I was already in Japan and I was on the train to the airport to meet Scott.
Oh, wow.
Scott was literally, I think it was about 40 minutes away from landing.
You were literally in the air?
I was in the air.
Yes.
That's crazy. We should have led with this.
And they said, we're delayed. They didn't give any reason yet. And then eventually they came on later and said, we're going to land in Osaka. There's been an earthquake in Tokyo. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do in Osaka? I don't speak the language. I don't know how to get back to Tokyo. Yeah. And then it turned out that we landed in Haneda instead.
That is quite far from Osaka.
Yeah, they were able to land in Haneda, thank goodness. And thank goodness we both had iPhones so we could communicate. I ended up sleeping on the floor in Haneda Airport and then figuring out how to get to the hotel the next day all by myself. And I think you were really surprised I was able to do that.
Well, I was on the Narita Express. I was 10 minutes away from Narita Airport, and I slept on the Narita Express overnight because we were trapped on the train. They couldn't move it.
Right.
And then I finally got to Narita. Scott got to Haneda, and then we had to find a way to meet at the hotel in Tokyo. And I don't know how he did it, but Scott found his way by himself from the airport in the middle of this major earthquake had just happened. And everything was in chaos.
It sounds terrifying.
It was terrifying. And then Tim had the great idea. We were going to go all over to Niigata. We had, were we going to go to Kanazawa too? Mm-hmm. We had all these plans, but we scrapped them. And Tim had the great idea to say, let's go south. So we got on a bullet train and we went to Fukuoka.
Yeah. So we decided to take the bullet train to Fukuoka, as Scott said, and then we spent a week there and we actually had a really good time.
Oh, it was amazing.
Wow. On that note, I think my understanding is that you made a suggestion.
Oh, I did.
One of your favorite sakes to sip. And so all three of us have some of this sake to taste and talk about. And it's the Kamoizumi Nigori Ginjo. In the States, they call this the Summer Snow. Nice name. I like that. And Tim, do you have any details on this one?
Well, this is a sake from Hiroshima, and the brewery is Kamoizumi Shuzo. This is Ginjo, and it's also a cloudy style, a Nigori. And the alcohol is a little bit higher, just above 17%.
Yeah.
And we have a 58% rice milling rate.
And I see the rice type over here is the Hatanishiki, which is we've talked about this one before. It's a local rice to Hiroshima.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and open this up.
Please do. So, for those listening at home, this is a Nigori. And if you are tasting a Nigori on your own at some point, do make sure that you have your Nigori. You want to gently tip it. Make sure that the sediment and the cloudiness gets all throughout the bottle. You don't want to just sip the top first. You want to make sure that's all mixed in.
So when Myshell was on the show, John, she picked the Naruto Tai Nama Genshu.
Yes, the Ginjo Nama Genshu. She likes her 18% alcohol sakes, and Scott apparently likes his 17.5% alcohol sakes. And what I think I've found is our significant others are trying to get us drunk.
So, Scott, why did you connect with this sake?
I think because it was so different from any alcohol that I'd really ever tried before. I think I do remember the first time we had it. It was at a Japanese restaurant. And I think I'd heard about Nigori and just wanted to try it. And it was a little viscous, a little sweet to me. And it just seemed to pair pretty well with the food that we were eating. I mean, it actually was wonderful. Nice. So that's why I connected with it.
And it's something you remembered, too.
Yeah.
I remember that you would, when you'd see it on the menu, you'd be like, oh, they have that Nigori here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Scott, why don't you grab your glass and give us a little sniff and tell us what are you smelling? What are you getting off of that?
Uh-oh. Am I going to be tested here?
You're No. As we talked about a few episodes back, that when you're tasting sake and describing stuff, just using your words. Don't worry about precision or what your sake samurai husband would say. Just what do you feel?
It just, I mean, I of course smell the alcohol for sure. And, I would say there's tiny little hints of like a little bit of citrus-ish, even though I know it doesn't taste like that to me.
When I smell it, if you think about like coconuts or pina colada smell, I get a little bit of that. There's a little bit of tropical fruit and a little bit of a coconut essence, I think. Do you smell that at all?
After you suggested it, yeah, I do smell that.
Yeah, when he said coconut, I was like, yeah, that's what it is. It was kind of like circling in my head, like, what is this thing? I can't quite nail it. And honestly, people, when you're thinking about sake, you usually don't think about coconut.
So I think there is a little bit of coconut, tropical fruit, and pina colada. That's something that I always associate with this. Let's give it a taste.
Yeah, let's. Is it bad that I'm still thinking about pina coladas?
And one thing that I always associate with this sake from going out with Scott and drinking this is Scott really likes to pair this with desserts, right?
Well, I think we actually had colleagues and they were teaching us how to cook Indian food. And so we were thinking, what would pair with the Indian food? And it turned out that the namas and I think nigori stood up really well to Indian food. So that's the other thought here, that it stands up well to even spicy food.
That sounds good. This is not the first time we've talked about dessert and sake with you today, so I think we're learning a few things. So it fought through those Indian spices well?
Oh, yeah. It really did. I was more surprised than maybe you were. And then the other thing it pairs really well with is, of course, people probably know of Levan Bakery, but they've got like a double chocolate chip cookie. And it pairs really well with
intimately familiar with those cookies.
Yeah. So the double chocolate Levan cookie pairs really well with this nigori.
Oh, I kind of want one of those now.
We should have brought them for this podcast recording.
The only thing about these cookies, while they are absolutely delightful, they're also like 800 calories for a cookie.
What?
But yeah, they're quite large.
What? Oh my God, I had no idea.
Really quickly, though, one interesting thing about this sake is that for the most part, this sake is being made for the Western market and not sold in Japan.
I have heard that. Yes.
Yeah. This year, has been made available in Japan, but I assume that might be pandemic related.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, this is a sake that is made and sold exclusively for export. And I think that's really interesting because it's like them saying, like, look, we think that this style is going to do really well over in New York where they have massive cookies and Indian food. And who knew? They were right. Look at you guys loving it. It's a nigori, but it's a very high alcohol nigori, which is, I want to say, a little unusual. Tim, do you think that's a little unusual?
It is. Yeah. Normally nigori, the thing that stands out about a nigori is the fact that it's cloudy, not that it's higher in alcohol. And this has two things going on. It's like the cloudy style, really, really pronounced texture to this sake. And then on top of that, it's noticeably higher in alcohol too. So when Scott sometimes goes out with coworkers and with other people, and I'm not there, and sometimes they have a sake menu in front of them. And I think, Scott, you've had enough experience with sake to really pick something out. You're going to know some of the brand names for sure, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you take note of some of the things that Tim puts in front of you to taste?
I think I remember the ones I like. So if we're really struck by something, I'll remember the name of it somehow and just know. Or if Tim talks about it enough, like I know some of the breweries that he likes. So I could recommend to friends, this one Tim likes, so you might like it as well.
Yeah, and it's also been 15 years of osmosis too.
Yeah, right.
Have you visited breweries with Tim?
Yes, we did. We went to, I think it was the Tokyo Brewery, the one we had to travel very far by train. I don't remember which one it was. I want to say, I'm going to get it totally wrong. What's it called?
Got it, John?
Is it?
Was it Sawanoi?
Yeah, it was Sawanoi.
Aha.
Yeah.
I was actually looking up which episode we talked about that trip. We talked about sake made in Tokyo, and Tim described this very beautiful area with this wonderful little bridge over a river and a wonderful tofu restaurant, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, it was amazing.
Oh, okay. So Tim's statement has been backed up by an independent party.
But what he maybe didn't say was we kind of got lost coming back, and it was an elementary school or middle school kid who kind of wanted to practice his English and was being so polite and told us which trains to go on to get back to Tokyo, because there were so many changes, right? We didn't know how to get back.
Wasn't that part of the cruise trip?
That was...
Yeah. That was when we were in the port of Tokyo. That was one of our...
That was the cruise
That was the
year.
2009 trip.
And guys, if you're curious about more details on the Sawanoi trip, that's going to be episode number 27. Got a lot of references this week, guys. Scott, when you are out without Tim, and there is sake available, or somebody asking perhaps about sake, what sorts of sakes do you then go and recommend to people who ask you about sake with your 15 years of osmosis and being around Tim all the time?
Well, so if it's a springtime, I would recommend the spring namas. And one of my favorites is Kamikokoro, because I think it's peach yeast. Yep. And it's just very, very bold and flavorful and not what you'd expect from a rice alcohol. And then I think if it's just a regular outing, I would recommend maybe more the Daiginjo style, a little finer and a little bit smoother. And then if they were interested in warm sake, I would recommend the Shichi Honyori. I know that was on one of your episodes as well. I think when you visited Decibel.
At Decibel,
yeah.
and we had it warm.
Scott, what would you recommend if one of your friends said, "Oh, what should I have with sushi?" What style of sake would you recommend for sushi?
I would recommend a drier style sake. I think you even visited a brewery clear out in the boonies and had to take a bus trip out. And you were the first Westerner that ever went there. I can't remember what the name of the sake is called.
That is another reference to a previous episode. That was my trip to Ishikawa when I went to the Noto Peninsula and I went to see Sogen Brewery.
Sogen, that's right.
Yes.
Technically, it's a reference to 2 episodes. I think we talked about that story twice. All right. Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure learning about a lot of the background between the two of you and your kind of adventures together, I think we can say, and of your love for cookies and desserts. I think we might have to, have you back again sometime. Maybe we'll grab Myshell and do a Married to Sake reunion sometimes.
That would be fun.
Well, if we do that, I'll bring the crazy sake.
Again, yes, thank you so much for taking time out, and we really appreciate it. And I think that it was fun getting some fun stories about our friendly neighborhood co-host.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I want to thank our listeners so much for tuning in. We really do hope that you're enjoying our show. If you'd like to show your support for Sake Revolution, one way you can really help us out would be to take a couple of minutes and leave us a written review on Apple Podcasts. It's one of the best ways for us to get the word out about our show.
And while you're getting the word out about our show, please be sure to subscribe to our show. This ensures that our episodes every week when we release them will show up magically in your device of choice. And while you're doing that, also please let your friends know. Tell a friend, help them tell their friends, and then have them subscribe as well.
And as always, to learn more about any of the topics or any of the sakes we talked about in today's episode, be sure to visit our website, sakerevolution.com, for all the detailed show notes.
And of course, if you have sake questions that you need answered, spouses of ours that you would like us to interview, or sakes you'd like us to talk about, please reach out to us at feedback@sakerevolution.com. So until next time, please remember to keep drinking sake, and all together, fellas,
Kanpai!
That was fun. That was so much fun to do, I think.
I'm glad you had fun.
Oh, you didn't like it? Did I embarrass you?
I had a blast. You looked really nervous sometimes.